This is history they never taught you. And this one almost ended the world. In 1962, the Cold War came down to 3 men inside a submarine. Most people remember the Cuban Missile Crisis as a tense political standoff. Missiles in Cuba, naval blockade, Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiating, and that story usually ends with crisis avoided. It feels controlled in hindsight. But at the time, it didn't feel controlled. It felt like the edge of something irreversible. Here's something important that usually gets simplified. The US had already placed nuclear missiles in Turkey, close to Soviet territory, so when the Soviets placed missiles in Cuba, they didn't see it as a random aggression. They saw it as balance. Both sides believing that they were responding, both sides felt threatened, and when fear drives decisions, escalation gets easier. Now, imagine being inside a Soviet submarine during that week. No satellite communication, no constant updates, underwater for days. It's hot, air quality is dropping, you haven't heard from Moscow, then suddenly, explosions outside the hull. Depth charges. The US Navy intended them as warnings, but the crew inside didn't know that. From their perspective, the war may already begun. What the American ships didn't know was that submarine was carrying a nuclear torpedo. Not conventional, nuclear. The captain on board believed they were under attack. He reportedly said something along the lines of, "If we're going down, we're taking them with us." That's not villainy, that's someone who thinks his country is already at war, and he had the authority to launch. But here's the detail that changes everything. On this submarine, B-59, launching required agreement from 3 senior officers. 3 votes. That's it. The captain voted yes, the political officer voted yes, 1 man voted no. His name was Vasili Arkhipov. Arkhipov argued that they didn't have confirmation of war. He argued that warning depth charges didn't equal nuclear conflict. He argued they should surface and wait for orders. Think about that. Inside a confined steel hull, cut off from communication, heat rising, tension maxed, and instead of escalating, he slowed it down. If that torpedo launches, a US ship is destroyed by a nuclear explosion. The United States responds, the Soviet Union responds, missiles were already positioned on both sides. Escalation would have been immediate. There wouldn't have been a long negotiation window. Historians widely agree that vote may have prevented nuclear war. Here's what makes the story powerful. We're taught that history moves through systems, economic forces, political ideology, military strength, and that's true, but sometimes massive systems narrow down to tiny pressure points. 3 votes inside a submarine. That's the pressure point. Zoomed out global superpowers, zoomed in 3 men exhausted underwater. That contrast matters because it shows just how fragile escalation can be. There's another detail that makes this even more unsettling. The United States didn't know that Soviet submarines were carrying nuclear torpedoes. That wasn't public information. So when American commanders dropped those depth charges, they thought they were signaling. The Soviets thought they were under attack. That's the part they rarely emphasize. Not aggression, miscommunication. 2 sides operating on incomplete information, assuming the worst, reacting to what they believed was happening. That's how escalation usually begins. Not with certainty, with assumption. Arkhipov wasn't reckless. He had previously survived a nuclear submarine accident years earlier. He understood risk, he understood the consequences. And instead of reacting emotionally, he questioned the assumption that war had already started. That hesitation changed the trajectory of history. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended with diplomacy. Missiles were removed from Cuba, missiles were quietly removed from Turkey, tensions eased. But none of that really matters if 1 vote goes differently underwater. 3 men, 2 in favor of launch, 1 against. And that margin between peace and nuclear war was smaller than most people realize. History doesn't always turn on force. Sometimes it turns on restraint. There's another part of the story that rarely gets discussed. After the submarine surfaced and contact was reestablished, the Soviet leadership realized how close things had came. In that moment, it changed policy. One of the first major outcomes of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the installation of the hotline, a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow. Before that, messages were delayed, translated, routed through intermediaries. During the crisis, some communications took hours. Hours. When nuclear weapons are involved, hours are dangerous. So after 1962, both sides recognized something important. The real threat wasn't just weapons, it was delay. It was misunderstanding, it was slow communication. That realization reshaped how the Cold War operated. Arms control agreements followed, direct lines of contact became standard, escalation procedures were reevaluated. In other words, the world didn't just survive that moment, it adapted because of it. And that's something we don't usually emphasize. We focus on how close it came to disaster, but we don't always talk about how it forced both sides to build better safeguards. The Cold War remained tense for decades, but it never again reached quite that same blind, uncontrolled edge. Not because tensions disappeared, but because both sides understood how thin the margin really was. And sometimes that awareness changes behavior. And that's history they never taught you. I will see you in the next match.